Welcome to the Athlete Hackers Podcast. My name is Chris Schrade.
And I'm Mark Spellman. Thanks for coming back, and really excited about our guest today, Sam Moore. We'll get to her in a minute. First, let's talk about our last two podcasts, Jeannie Stevens, yoga, and Chris Hagman, athletic trainer. Main takeaway I took away from Jeannie was make sure that you take time for yourself and be present in the moment and focus on your breathing in order to recover and be better for yourself. And the one with
my major takeaway from that is how important alignment is for injury prevention and optimal performance.
That's why we're on the show together, because we complement each other.
A mind meld.
And the one with Chris Hagman was the importance of the sports medicine and strength and conditioning coach relationship and how they need to work together in order to best serve the student athlete.
Yeah, and I think that's huge for both parents and athletes who are heading into college, so that they know right off from the start what that relationship involves.
And yes, there's an athletic trainer and a strength and conditioning coach, and they're not the same person.
Mm-hmm.
So know the difference, please.
And listen to them.
Without further ado, this is going to be an awesome episode. I am so psyched to have this person on.
Cutting edge athlete hacking right here, right now.
Exactly. So, Coach Sam Moore from North Carolina State University. She is in her second year, I believe, as an assistant. Oh, in her first year as assistant strength and conditioning coach, applied science at North Carolina State University. And today we are going to discuss the menstrual cycle and how it affects and what you can do to optimize the cycle.
Awesome. Welcome,
Coach
Sam.
Moore.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so stoked to be here. Thank you, guys.
So little background in this wonderful pandemic world. I had the pleasure to hear Coach Moore present at the basketball symposium webinar. Coach Rock Stevenson, my man out in Utah, always finding wonderful speakers to present. And Coach Moore presented on the menstrual cycle and how athletes can utilize it and how coaches should better understand the cycle for their athletes to not only perform in the weight room, but more importantly, how to perform optimally on the playing field. Coach Moore, first and foremost, how did you get to NC State? And let's talk about your path to where you currently are and what you're doing.
Oh man, that's such a good question. Yeah, so I guess I should start at the beginning. So I'm from Oregon, a really small town in Oregon. I grew up with a very active family. Both of my parents were collegiate All-Americans. And so they moved back to Newport, which is where my dad's from, and they raised me and my brother there. So I played a bunch of sports growing up. Volleyball was always my favorite, even though I was not that good at it for a long time, a bit of a late bloomer. But my mom she won 2 national titles at Portland State back in her day. She was an All-American, and she got drafted. They had an indoor pro league at the time. I think it collapsed a couple of years later, but I digress. So I was raised in just a very athletic family and a very, hardworking family, and it was awesome, and I loved it. I got to do everything. I played football, I did swimming. They tried to get me into some more like arts and crafts type of skills because I was really not developing as an athlete. And then I had a big growth spurt, and I went from like 5'5" to 6'1". So I went on to college, and I played 2 sports in college. I was a volleyball player, and then I did track and field my senior year in college as a heptathlete. And that was awesome. And so my freshman year in college, I was playing at University of Portland, and I suffered a pretty significant knee injury. And when I went into college, I was an English major because that's what I scored the best on my SAT. So I figured I should probably just do what I'm good at. And then going through my surgery, I realized I loved talking about the anatomy and physiology and my rehab and how that combined with strength and conditioning. And so I switched to biology at UP because that was the only major that they had that was related. And I really got close with my strength coaches there because my injury was one of not a lot of people come back from it. And if they do, it's usually not a great career. And so they kind of left it up to me, the surgeon, in terms of like, you know, coming back, because at first they thought it was an ACL, and then they realized that it was my cartilage and my patella. And so I had my first surgery my freshman year, and I spent a lot of time in those 9 months of recovery with my strength coaches at Portland, and they were absolutely incredible. And the environment that they provided for me, I was lucky because I liked lifting before I got there, but it was a space where I could still feel successful, even though I didn't have my sport, right? And at the time, everything about my identity was a volleyball player. That's all I knew. That's all I wanted to know. I wrote a paper in my freshman year of college about how God put me here to play volleyball. And I did not want to think about anything past volleyball because grown-ups were liars. There was no life after sports. And so I played my sophomore year, and I wanted a program that was more suited towards the exercise physiology part of things. And so that's when I transferred to Western Oregon. And Western is where I played volleyball and then did track. I had my first internship there with Corey Metzger, which was incredible, great learning experience. And I absolutely loved Western. Like, my education was great. I'm still Facebook friends with some of my professors, which is so cool. And I loved it. I loved the community. That was where my dad played football. My brother was playing football at the time, so I got to go to school with my older brother. And I loved it. And family is huge to me. And so obviously I had real family on the campus, but I also, you know, I had grown up with the head football coach, Arn Ferguson, because he had played with my dad. And so I knew him since the time I was really little. And the AD at the time was one of my dad's football coaches. And so I had known him for a long time. So the family aspect at Western was absolutely incredible for me. And so it was one of the best choices I think I've made in my entire career. So from there, I went back up to University of Portland, actually, and I took an internship in their weight room up there, and I worked at this coffee shop on the side, and I ended up getting promoted really quickly in this coffee company, and it's a company called Dutch Bros, and it's a West Coast company. And it's about, like, you serve coffee, but it's really about kind of influencing optimism and positivity around you and impacting people through relationships. And so I got hired for this position at Dutch Bros called a mobster. And what a mobster was is I just traveled around, and they would like send me places for weeks at a time, and I would go live there, and I would help start stands and hire people and train people and teach people how to interact and how to be positive and how to, you know, foster really healthy relationships with the people around you. And that was a really unique opportunity because I was not raised in a household that was really big on like feelings. We didn't talk a lot about how we felt. And so that stretched, like, you know, I learned the elasticity of the human condition and the human heart in that job. And it really challenged me to learn to be vulnerable and to be empathetic. And it developed my emotional intelligence in a way that I had never really been tested before. And so I did that for a couple years. And then I realized that I think, you know, the other side of my brain just felt a little lonely over there. And so I decided that I wanted to get into college athletics, but I didn't exactly know the capacity, but I knew I needed a master's. So I enrolled in an online master's program, and I got a teaching license because my mom is a principal, my dad's a dean of students, and so I knew I could get substitute teaching jobs. And I was like, great, you can make really good money as a sub almost anywhere. And I was like, all right, I'm gonna condense master's program, so it's 2-year master's in one. I'll go home in Oregon, I'll, you know, live with family, and I'll teach a couple days a week and then do my master's, right? And my master's is in exercise science, performance enhancement. And so I am about to move back to Oregon, and I get this call from this lady, and she's like, hola. And I was like, hola. And it was a principal from a high school in the district that I used to play against. And my mom used to be a vice principal and an AD there. And she's like, do you speak Spanish? And I said, no, you know, I took sign language as my foreign language in college. And she's like, well, you're hired. And I was like, I didn't apply for a job, ma'am. And she said, we had a health emergency with our high school Spanish teacher, and you're the only person that has a license to be able to do it, and I know you have an open schedule. I called your mom. And I was like, I don't speak Spanish. I'm so sorry. I just don't speak it. And I would like to be clear, I don't want this job. And she said, "You're the only one that we have." And so that's when I became Senorita Moore, and I was a high school Spanish teacher and the department head for foreign language for a semester. And that was one of the most challenging things I've ever done, right? Because I'm doing my master's, I'm going home, I'm learning Spanish the night before to go teach it the next day, to like Spanish ones, like I'm preparing kids for college, like it's advanced high school Spanish. And that was so taxing. I had never taken a class in education. I had never worked in a school. This lady, she was just banking that I was like my parents and I was good with kids. And so I was a full-time Spanish teacher.
She did.
And then at the end,
she did call your mom though.
she called my mom first to see if I was free and had plans. My mom's like, "No, Sam's totally free. She's got no plans. Sign her up."
You couldn't say no.
I tried. I was like, "I would like to be very transparent here. No, I don't want the job."
See you Monday.
Yeah, and she was like, "Great. So I already cleaned out your desk and I found you a textbook." I'm like, "Okay, cool."
Your desk.
Yeah. And so that's when Senorita Moore was born. And that was a huge moment of growth, right? Like a huge season. Like those kids were tough. Like high school kids can be so vicious, but they can also be so rewarding to work with. And so at the end of that year, I did some volunteer coaching for the track team at my high school that I went to, which was about 30 minutes away from the one I was teaching at. And so then at the end of the year, they're like, "Okay, you did so well. Do you want to be our full-time Spanish teacher next year?" And I said, "Absolutely not. No, thank you. I'm not doing this. You're not roping me in. I won't do it." But I love the school that I work with, and they had offered me the head coaching position for the track and field team. And so I said, "If you can find a subject that's anything but Spanish, I'll do it. I'll teach it, whatever." And so it's a 7-12 school, and they got me the health and PE position for the middle school the next year. So I was like, "Oh, easy. I can do that. No worries. That's in my native tongue. I got it. Let's do it." And to be totally honest, that year of middle school PE and health was 10 times harder than the year of Spanish. Because even though it didn't require as much lesson planning, my class sizes were 40 to 50 plus kids. I was by myself. I had still never been through a teacher prep program, so I didn't technically know how to teach, even though I figured it out.
So you actually went into babysitting is what you went into.
Oh, 100%. But because it was health, I had to figure out like ways to put in health literacy. So we would do a journal every day. Like they would come in and it was so big, the class was so big that I had to grid out the whole gym floor, and they each had a plot line that like that was their spot, like their G7 or H2. And so I had letters on one wall and numbers on the other wall, and they would get their journal and they would go to their plot and they would do, like we did a gratitude journal once for 30 days, or we would do different discussion questions, and we would talk about, we did a women in sports unit, of course. We had to do a sex ed unit, so I got to teach sexual education to middle schoolers for a week. That was exciting.
A lot of giggling.
A lot of questions that are burned in my memory. I will never forget. But it's a school that is 50% homeless, and 93% of those students live in families below the poverty line. And so I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the ACEs study with Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, but it's the Adverse Childhood Experiences. And so what it is it's this list of, there's less than 10, but it's these markers of trauma, of different types of trauma. And if a child experiences 4 of them, their lifelong health outcomes are insane. Like their chances of suicide go up by 1,200%. The chances of being sexually abused go up by over 20%. And these statistics are true every time. And so what I ended up doing for my master's thesis was I did a side-by-side literature review of different adverse childhood experience studies and youth sport programs, because right now we know that the only way to offset these health outcomes is a positive adult buffer. And so my proposal was that if we structure youth sport programs to develop resiliency and grit while offering the opportunity to create that relationship with the positive adult buffer, that we offset outcomes for, essentially the population that I was working with. And so that was something that I never expected to get into. I never expected to learn about. I had no idea. I had never heard of it before I got into teaching, but I was having these outbursts with these kids and I didn't understand it. Like I couldn't really fathom it. And so I was told to watch this documentary called Paper Tigers, and it was filmed actually in Washington. And so I learned about it, about what does it look like to have to work with a child who is experiencing trauma, and what happens to them physiologically. Like there's this chemical cascade, and they are always in fight or flight because of the trauma that they're experiencing at home, and maybe they don't have a home, and all of those things. And so working with kids in those populations was one of the most eye-opening, heart-opening, heart-wrenching experiences that I've ever had. And I think that's what made teaching PE that year so difficult, because middle schoolers are in that part where like high schoolers can hide it, right? High schoolers can like fake their way through it and they'll just be mean, and you know, like they're not gonna, they can control it a little bit better sometimes, but middle schoolers, they can't control a dang thing. And so they are just like losing their lids all the time, and you're like, what's going on? And like I remember the first week that we made it through a whole week with no fist fights in my class, and it was like going into winter break, and I was like, this is a win. And it was crazy. I mean, you've got like 48 kids playing pickleball, and you've got a fist fight of four middle school boys in the corner, and you're like separating them, carrying them out of class, but I'm by myself, so I'm like still teaching the other 44 kids that are playing pickleball, and I'm trying to get these kids, you know, like, you're just like, you're living in chaos all the time. And so when I was there, I called my friend Kat Wade, who's my strength coach at Portland, and I said, listen, I know that this is good, important work that I'm doing, but I do not have the wherewithal to do this for more than a year. Like I can't take, I didn't want to teach originally. I know I needed to now in hindsight, but I need to get into college sports. That's really where I want to be. I don't have the passion for this that you need if you're going to do it long term. And that's why we see so much teacher burnout, even for people that knew they wanted to be teachers. And so she told me about Ernie Reimer. And I was like, that's a weird name, but I'll listen to it. And so I just, you know, I think I listened to some of his podcasts or something. And then a couple months later, I saw that he had posted an internship at Utah. So I applied for his sports science internship. I didn't know what a sports scientist was. I didn't know what sports scientists did. I had never really heard the term. And I think I had 6 of the 10 qualifications or something, but I applied anyway because Kat told me to. And I got an interview, and in my interview, I told the Spanish story, and I truly think that's the only reason I got the job. I was like, listen, I don't know what you do. I don't know probably 40% of the words that you're saying to me right now, Ernie, but what I can tell you is that I'll work hard and I'll learn whatever you need me to learn, even if it's a foreign language. There in Utah, I got to work. He would make me try and get out of my box of volleyball, and I didn't want to, but I did it sometimes. So I worked as his intern in the summer, doing a few different projects, and then volleyball actually hired me through like a stipend to be their sports scientist for the fall. So he was still like my director in terms of like, he would help me with my projects and kind of, you know, do that. But then the head volleyball coach was ultimately like my supervisor. And so I got to do some crazy cool projects with them. But most of my work was in strategic periodization at Utah. And so I managed their on-court technology, and then, you know, did all the planning and the adjustments for what we saw in the data. And that was a really, really awesome experience, working with people who perform at such a high level, and not just the athletes, but the coaches. So getting to learn from Beth Lanier at Utah was, it was absolutely incredible experience. Just watching the way that she interacts with her players and the way that she molds her personality based on what the team needed at that time in that year was really, really, it's something that I've never really seen a coach do at that capacity. And so
what sport is that, Sam?
Indoor volleyball.
For those that don't know, explain the difference between an applied sports scientist and a strength and conditioning coach, even though you hold both titles right now.
Right. So it's interesting because I think a lot of strength coaches do sports science, right? So sports science at Utah, we just, you know, we said that we research, we inform, we innovate. So we research a problem, whatever the problem is, whatever the question is, whatever we're trying to solve. We see if there's, you know, evidence of it in literature. If there is, can we apply that evidence to what we're doing? And that would be evidence-based, right? When you can take an application directly from research and you can put it into, you know, whatever problem it is. And then if you can't direct it, you know, directly apply it, we call it evidence informed. So we take what's in research and we say, okay, here's what we know in research, and here's how we're going to try and apply it here to solve this problem. And that's what our innovation is. So, for an example, at Utah for their indoor volleyball program, their sport performance initiative was to plan on-court load at practice and periodize through the whole season. And then strategic periodization is not, so tactical periodization is like sport specific. Strategic periodization is all the different factors that can go into performance, right? Like when we fly, where we fly, who we're playing, what our nutrition looks like, all those different things. And so I managed all those. And that was an innovation that was made by Ernie. So sports scientists can be much more wide ranging in the problems that we solve. They can be problems of scheduling. We can talk about, specific technique. We can do, a lot of it can be applied to strength and conditioning, right? So strength and conditioning can be a route to implement those innovations or interventions. So for Utah, they had a lot of oblique strains for their volleyball players. So that was the problem. How do we solve this problem of so many players with oblique strains? They developed a protocol that they implemented in the summer of different rotational movements and different eccentric work and things that they had found in research, and then they changed and applied it to who they had. And then they reevaluate at the end of the season, how many oblique strains did we have this year? And so that kind of determines the efficacy of it. So the strength and conditioning coach can be a route to implement those interventions and innovations that are created by the sports science of it. And that's why I say a lot of strength coaches are already doing sports science in their daily work, right? Like if you have a team that has a lot of ACL tears, you're like, okay, we need to look at what's in literature for ACL tears for this basketball team. What do you find? You implement it in your warm up or in your lift or in your cool down, and then you see if it works and you reevaluate the next year. And so, ultimately that's what sports science is. So there's a lot of sports science in what we do already. Sports scientists just use a fancy title for it.
And you use those big words. You use those big words that are in the books.
Right.
So for those that don't know, smaller schools usually don't have, the department size that Sam has worked at Utah and NC State. As I've stated before on this podcast, I was one guy working with 400 athletes and 20 programs. And I would love to have had a sports scientist or just another staff member, to be honest with you, to bounce ideas off. But for those that are looking to go to schools, understand, what you're getting into as far as your department size and how many people you're going to be working with, because even though on your recruiting trip, they're going to show you all the pretty buildings and everything, you might not see all the people that are going to be in your life for the next 4 years. So,
yeah. I think something that I was talking about the other day too is, especially having played at like a mid-major and then now working at these Power Fives, it's interesting the way that resources can allow for so much growth and so much development, but they can also sometimes, if not used correctly, be really stifling, right? So the more people you have, the more siloed that you become in what you can do and the actions that you can take. And so, at NC State, I feel really, really blessed to have a very well-rounded team of professionals that I work with. So the athletic trainers that I work with and the dietitian that I work with, they allow me to give input and to give ideas, and they take it and it's very, Ernie has this really interesting model of like transdisciplinary, which is where everyone does everything. And even though that's probably not possible in the NCAA context, we can be really interdisciplinary with how we integrate with each other. And so I'm lucky that, the two places that I've worked at are very integrated. We had a very high functioning sport performance team for the indoor volleyball team at Utah. And then now at NC State, just the professionals that I work with and how they function, we're very integrated in that. But at a lot of universities, the more people that you have, the less that you can do, and your job description becomes really shaved down. And so in a sports science context, that can be difficult because sometimes people don't understand the range of problems that we can help fix.
Also, the last podcast we had with Chris Hagman, is the athletic trainer, college men's battle. you know, a lot of times when you get more chefs in the kitchen, it becomes a muddled mess for the people that you're working with. And it sounds like the departments that you've worked with, they've really had a synergistic balance between everybody working together and having one common voice and allowing everybody to kind of be a piece to the puzzle,
Yeah.
figure out for that athlete.
Totally. And it's funny when you were talking about in your previous podcast, the relationship part of it. And I could not agree more. As an athlete, I could feel when the athletic trainer and the strength coach were at odds. I knew, I was well aware. And then to go into it as a coach, and when I was at Utah, my roommate was our athletic trainer. She let me move in with her when my contract got extended because I was like, oh no, I'm going to be homeless. And so she let me live with her, and we would sit at home and we would problem solve these rehabs together, and I would bring my volleyball knowledge and she would bring her athletic training knowledge, and it was incredible. It was so fun that's how we got to do it. And that was like our nightly dinner, like bring your laptop to the table, let's figure out some overhead blocking motions.
Well, and I think and I've said this with a couple of coaches, I hope when the pandemic's over that this open dialogue and discussion with strength and conditioning coaches continues to happen. You know, I'm one of those dinosaurs that, you know, back when I first started, people would argue about, you know, what training methodologies they were using, and they wouldn't talk if somebody wasn't like using their style of training. I mean, I think thankfully we've hopefully evolved a little bit where, you know, we're not going to argue whether we're front squatting or back squatting. It seems we're going to argue where we need to put our hands when we breathe after we run a sprint now. Which, okay, whatever. Are we going to put our hands on our head, or are we going to put our hands on our knees? Whatever. I mean, if my best player's scoring 30 points, you can put your hands wherever you want. So take us up to where you are now, what you're doing. I was just truly, you know, as somebody who has been in the profession over 25 years and gone to a bunch of seminars and listened to a bunch of webinars and all that good stuff to get better, your presentation at the basketball symposium on the menstrual cycle really hit a chord with me, because I think it's something that a lot of coaches don't take into consideration, and most coaches don't even know about it. Like they don't want to talk about it. You know, when I was at Fairfield, we had an athlete who would get really bad cramps, and it would really affect what she could do and all of that. And but we always had an open dialogue of what was going on with her, and how she was feeling, and, you know, all that good stuff. So take us into a little bit of more of what you're doing now, and your doctoral dissertation and the presentation minus the slides.
Yeah. Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah. So I was at Utah. I saw this posting for the director of sports science at NC State. I didn't apply for it. I didn't think I was ready to be a director. I had looked up the last guy who had been in that position. He already had his PhD. He was publishing research. He was very well known. He went to an NBA team, and I said, oof, I've got 6 months in. There's no way. And so Ernie called me and told me I should apply. And Kat called me and told me I should apply. And Brad Scott called me and told me I should apply, because they all knew Nate. And so
did your mom call them and tell them to hire you?
Shelly probably did. Honestly, she probably messaged them on Facebook. Yeah, and so it's so funny too, because my parents, they try so hard to know what I do, and so much of my family has no idea. Like, so one of my cousins thought I was playing volleyball at Utah. I was like, sir, I am 26. Like, you came to my senior night in college. What is wrong with you? But yeah, so I ended up applying for it. Nate didn't actually look at my resume at first because I was too young. And then Ernie called him, and I think Big Brad called him, and they were like, just look at it, you know, it'll be worth it. And so he gave me an interview. And in the first interview, he asked me what my dream job was. And I said, right now, I need a hybrid position. I need no more than 2 teams, women's teams. I need a coaching staff that's going to give me control of their strength and conditioning. And I need a director of my department that's going to build sports science into my position. and have time for that. Because if you're going to give me 14s and just expect me to juice on the side, there's not enough time. But also understand that I want to go bigger with this. It's not just resistance training. It's not just conditioning. I want to develop full procedures and plans for every part of performance for these women's teams long term. And so I need the control of strength and conditioning, right? I need that full access to implement these interventions. And I need time to create them, because a lot of this I'm doing in real time, right? So how do I program for, a monophasic oral contraceptive versus a triphasic oral contraceptive, and who's on what? I have to, create those whole programs by scratch right now, because we don't necessarily have any programs or any, frameworks to follow yet. And you come across problems when you do this that you probably didn't prepare for. So, amenorrhea with an athlete not on birth control, with an athlete on birth control, what does that look like? And so that's what I told him. And then maybe 6-week interview process, I had to do a bunch of projects, and it was very overwhelming. And he ultimately called me and he offered the job description that I had told him I wanted, verbatim back to me. And I was stunned. I didn't have words. I was so shocked. And so I ended up moving out here after we finished the NCAA tournament with Utah volleyball in late December.
How'd you do?
We made it to the Sweet 16, and then we lost to Stanford, but we finished ranked 9th in the nation.
Awesome.
Cool.
Incredible experience. Yeah.
They probably were not happy to lose you.
Yeah, that's true. Beth and I had a good conversation about it. And she's awesome. She's so cool. So just to even have, 8 months with her, and that's kind of the reason that I held up. I wasn't sure if I wanted to leave her and Ernie, to be totally honest, because they were such incredible mentors for me, and they had helped me grow so much in ways that I was comfortable and ways I was uncomfortable. And so I just didn't know if I was going to be able to find people like that to create that environment, because I loved my time at Utah so much. But, NC State had a salary for me. And so I was excited about that. So I, kind of took the leap, and Nate really revealed his true colors in that 6-week interview process. And I just believed in him. I believed in who he was, and I believed in, the people that had interactions with him. And I need transparency in the leader. I don't do well when that's not present. And I like competition, obviously, but I need to feel seen. And then we can question each other. Then we can get into some nitty gritty and stuff. But I need to feel valued as soon as I step in the room for just who I am as a person, and seeing who as I am as a person. And then let's get professional. And I felt he communicated that to me really, really well.
I think for a lot of young coaches, they need to understand that you are in control of the positions that you take. And I think one of the big things, to have a plan of where you want to go professionally is huge. And you just don't have to settle for crumbs. I mean, you got into this, you went into a job interview and basically told your boss what you were going to do.
bold move.
It's huge. I mean, where a lot of people, because of our profession being so oversaturated, and there not being as many positions as there are people that want to do the jobs, not that they're qualified, but they think they are. But the importance of having the self-confidence that you had going into, a Power 5 school from another Power 5 school, and being like, this is what I'm going to do. I understand this is the job, but this is how I see the job, and this is how I think I would be best utilized here. So, I mean, I think a lot of strength coaches don't take the time to understand their self-worth, and they wind up getting into positions where they get over their head and get, burn out real quick. Yeah.
I think too, I don't think that we're taught enough about how to create positions based on what we want to do, right? It's, when you're little, they're like, do you want to be a doctor or, an astronaut? And for me, it was I could be a teacher, or I could be Amelia Earhart. Those were the two things I remember in my head when I was little, that I was one of the two, that's it. Those are my only options. And I wasn't taught that until I worked at Dutch Bros, and I had a lead mobster, Ashley Smith, and she taught me that just because the job description is written, that was written by the person who left, right? That doesn't have to define what you do. If you bring this skill set, that you believe is necessary, you got to say it and you got to own it and you have to set the expectation. And Ernie was huge in that, in teaching me how to explain my value in a way that I could mold that position so that I could be successful. Because I knew what I wanted, and I wasn't going to find a job description that wrote that, right? Like I was not going to find a job description posted on the CSCCA website that said, menstrual cycle scientist, we want you, you know? And so I had to create it. And that was terrifying. That was so terrifying, especially as a woman. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the book Brave, Not Perfect, but the author talks about how women are taught to be perfect and men are taught to be courageous. So to go into this role and to say, this is what I need, and I know it's new and I know no one's done it, it's scary for you and for me. It's totally terrifying because you don't know. You think that it reflects on your value and you don't know if people are going to recognize that. And if they don't, does it mean I'm not valuable? Does it mean that I don't offer as much as I think I do? And so it was really terrifying. But when I got here, it was incredible. Working with Nate is incredible. He's awesome. He gives me freedom where I need it. And he gives me structure also where I need it and where I want it. And he is a very transparent leader. And so I came in and the coaches and the staff knew what I was brought here to do, right? I was brought here to develop these applications for female athletes. That's what I do. That's what I talk about. I don't want to work with male athletes. I don't have a desire, and I'm fine with that, right? And so it's interesting when people have that same thing, they want to work with football, right? They're like, I want to work with the FBS football team. And people are like, yeah, like that makes sense. But when you say it for female athletes, people don't understand. They're like, well, what do you have against male athletes? I'm like, nothing. They just don't have periods.
They don't have a menstrual cycle.
Exactly. Like they just don't apply. Sorry. And
I'd argue that because I've been around enough male athletes that I think they do have a cycle. I mean,
yeah.
So Sam, going back to one of the things you said earlier about strategic versus tactical periodization, just in layman's terms, I'm assuming the menstrual cycle stuff fits into the strategic periodization. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So tactical is like sport specific technique, and like an interlaying specific technique drills and development for like whatever team you're going to play.
Yeah.
Like if you're in volleyball, if we're going to play Oregon, Monica Stone has that gnarly slide. We're going to really work on our left front blockers quick too, because that's going to be the block move that they need to block her. So that would be a tactical periodization. But strategic periodization is kind of all of the other factors outside of that and how they interplay together. Menstrual cycle periodization would likely fit into the strategic periodization, but I would almost ask us to separate it. So in my head, there's a lot out there right now about like athlete management systems, right? AMS, we hear it all the time. And so I would propose cycle-based athlete management. So every strategy of training and recovery and performance that we implement, in my opinion, obviously biased, should be dependent on the hormonal landscape of the player. So their post-match nutrition should be dependent on where they are in their cycle. Their pre-match nutrition, their mid-match nutrition should all be dependent on where they are in their cycle. Their warm-up could change. Their sports psych, so the strategies that they have in pregame could change based on cycle. Obviously, their strength and conditioning can change through cycle. And so the way that if we're going to create this athlete management system, we really have to understand these foundational building blocks that we're working with. And in my opinion, women are different than men. Actually, that's not my opinion, that's science. But so if we're going to manage these athletes, we have to understand the hormonal landscape that we're working with, right? So like in a competitive season, you're not going to go have a really hard lift the day after a game, right? They're fatigued, they're sore, their muscle voluntary contraction levels are diminished. And so their capacity to gain mass, to gain strength is diminished in that phase. It's the same thing in the menstrual cycle. If we are in a diminished hormonal landscape because of our cycle, going hard for max strength or going for hypertrophy, we can't do it. We're catabolic at default from the instance of progesterone. And so understanding the roadmap of the cycle and then creating our interventions based on the cycle that's what I do.
I'm gonna.
So now with the sports science part, I heard you say earlier, like typically you're starting with a problem and then working on
Solutions.
the solutions from there. Are we talking? I don't know. I don't know if I'm saying this right, but you obviously can't start with the menstrual cycle as a problem. There's probably a couple different problems because of that. Is that the best way to frame it?
Yeah, you could frame it like that. In the way that I frame it is, how do we optimize the training and the treatment of our female athletes?
So it's more from starting like with a particular problem. It's really more of a 40,000-foot view.
It's a 40,000-foot view, I think, and I think we need to start there because, like Mark was saying, it's so distant from what we talk about in the strength and conditioning world. It's so distant from what we talk about in the sports-specific training world that we have to start 40,000. We have to develop some general applications, and then we can start to problem solve. And the specific problem solving, that's kind of the hurdles that I hit in real time, right? So if I've got an athlete that's on the depot shot, how would I train that athlete for the depot shot? What's their hormonal landscape for the 3 months of the activity of that shot? And then knowing the different effects of different hormones, how can I structure that training? If I have an athlete that's amenorrheic, who am I going to call? Am I going to call athletic trainer and say, hey, she hasn't had a period in X amount of time. Let's send her to student health. Let's get her into contact with dietitian. Let's make sure that she's not in low energy availability or in red S. Because now we know that female athlete triad isn't a thing now. We call it red S. It can happen to men or women. Or, do I have an athlete with cramps? Do they have such debilitating cramps that they can't play? Is birth control the option? Or can we supplement it nutritionally? Can we have some behavior changes, some educational changes to be able to allow the same amount of alleviation from those symptoms? So what are our specific symptom interventions based on the individual? So we start 40,000, and then as soon as you start tracking, you're going to realize that you're going to have a lot more hurdles than you ever considered. And that's a blessing and a curse, right? Because there are all these things that women didn't feel that they could bring to the table. I didn't feel like I could bring to the table the fact that I was driving to practice and I heard a song and I instantly cried, and then my friend said something that I took as mean, and I just had a garbage day. I can't bring that to the table at practice. What's my coach going to say? How do we mitigate that? And so
I definitely couldn't bring that to the table during my practices either.
Right, exactly. And when we're taught about periods, we're taught that it's a moment of weakness. And so the cultural perception of periods is wrong. It's foundationally wrong. There's a documentary on Netflix about menstruation in India, and it will blow your mind how undereducated this topic is around the world, and even in America itself. Like, we just don't teach our women what's really happening with their body and then how to help it. And so my whole stance is, it's not an excuse, right? It is not an excuse to say like, oh, I can't play because I have cramps, because I'm in my luteal phase, because I have primary dysmenorrhea. When we educate our athletes, we then empower them to become accountable. So if I tell my athletes, if you have cramps, here are some strategies, boom, 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 boom. And they come to lift and like, I can't lift, I've got cramps. Well, you knew the strategies. What did you try? Did you try none of them and you just blamed it on your cramps and you're not taking accountability for it? Or did you try some of them, they didn't work? We need to reevaluate and figure out a strategy that works for you. So the more education we can give them, the more empowerment and the more accountability.
If one of my athletes came to me and said all that you just said, I probably would give them the day off.
Right? And
I don't know half of the words you just said.
And the thing is like, it's real. Like, it really does affect us. It really affects our athletes. But, male coaches and female coaches alike, it's not a topic that we understand in terms of performance. So then we don't think that we can talk about it because we think it's a personal health issue. Or there are a number of different terms I've heard that people consider the menstrual cycle under. And so if we can frame it in performance for these coaches and we can explain it in performance, then we can talk about it with our athletes. I was so stoked on Thursday. I was like walking off the soccer field. I'm working with some athletes coming back from some injuries. And this one athlete stopped. She's like, hey, can I talk to you about my period and birth control? And I was like, this is about parenting. Must feel like I'm so proud. Oh my gosh, it was great. She's like, well, I've noticed this and this. And so I read this and I was wondering what I should do here. And it was awesome and it was empowering. And now she's accountable to this information to make her own decisions on what's best for her body.
Yeah, I think what we first need you to do is to break down the different parts of the cycle. one, for never experiencing it outside of having a wife and a 16-year-old daughter and coaching for 25 years and having most of probably half of my athletes being female athletes. I mean, the only time that I would touch on their menstrual cycle was if we were doing body fat and the numbers came all whacked out and they got all whacked out on whether they were or were not on their period. Once again, my wife would smack me in the head because you're never on your period. It's not a ride, as she likes to tell
Amen.
me. Not a ride. You're not on it, damn it.
Right.
I got a follow-up question because during the presentation, you know, it was the misnomer that when a bunch of female athletes get together, they sync up their cycle. And you're like, no, that for all you dumbasses out there, that doesn't happen. My wife would like to argue that with you,
Okay.
because our 16-year-old, when she got her cycle, it automatically kicked my wife back into being on the same kind of schedule as my daughter.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could, a couple things, if you could go through what a normal quote cycle looks like for all the male coaches and female coaches and athletes out there, because I think there is not a lot of information out there about what it is and the different hormonal balances and imbalances that you have during that time. So
yeah, to clarify, I didn't say dumbass. Just for my
I said dumbass.
for when my mom listens.
Oh,
just to tell her that.
Yes,
yeah.
Coach Moore, that was me. I'm sorry.
I'm just kidding.
I've got potty mouth.
Yeah, it's okay. So if we're going to talk about a eumenoric cycle, which is a natural cycle, day one of the cycle is the first day of the period. So that's what starts the cycle. And that's what kicks off the follicular phase. And so the follicular phase is when the follicle develops to be released as an egg. And so the follicular phase is comprised by the lowest hormonal content of progesterone or estrogen of the entire cycle during menstruation. And that's when we can see some of our best performances, strength output, power output, endurance, submax tests, is during menstruation, because that content of progesterone is really low. And so understanding that when you're on your period, even if you might feel not great, your physiological capacity is through the roof. Like, your ceiling is so high to develop hypertrophy, basic strength, max strength. Like, that's when you can really target the mTOR pathway, because we don't have catabolism present. And so that's really important. And that's a big education aspect for our athletes. And I've read research on it as well. So when we have athletes that experience primary dysmenorrhea, which is pelvic pain not related to an infection, so it's menstrual cramps, education around what's happening and what they're actually capable of can lessen the severity of symptoms, just teaching our athletes what they can do. So then we have menstruation, which is that shedding of the lining, and then we see estrogen start to build in preparation for ovulation, which is when we release the egg. So estrogen is building, and that's important because estrogen is anabolic. So estrogen helps us build muscle, and we can see that estrogen results in improved submax test speed. And then we see testosterone has its only bump right there before ovulation as well, and during ovulation. So about 36 hours before you ovulate, which marks the middle of your cycle, you can have an increased potential in your 1 rep max by 10%.
Wow.
That's huge, right? So if we know that as coaches, we can start to, allow a little bit of flexibility for maxing. Right. So if we're going to hit training maxes, if we know when the opportune time is to do that, have you ever had an athlete not make a training, like not when you're testing and not only do they not improve on their training max, but they do worse. They're destroyed. They're like, I've been working my butt off for 8 weeks. Why is it not getting better? Well, they probably just didn't hit it at the right time. Right. So having some flexibility when you're hitting your training maxes, you can see that. If they don't, some women feel really flat before ovulation. And so you can look for that training bump after. And if you're tracking the emotional and physical symptoms, then you can kind of scope out when athletes feel their best and hit their training maxes then. And so we have ovulation, which is in the follicle, is a full-grown mature egg. And so that's when follicle stimulating hormone kind of builds in that follicular phase. That's the first half. And then when ovulation hits, luteinizing hormone is what triggers the release of that mature egg. So the egg is mature, luteinizing hormone, boop, we release the egg, and that bump in luteinizing hormone is what causes progesterone to heighten in the second phase. So if we look at it as like a mountain range, this first half is really low, it's a valley. Then we see the estrogen bump for ovulation and the small testosterone hill for ovulation. And then both of those come down while we're in now the luteal phase, so the second half. And so those mountains are coming down. We see this little valley. And while those mountains are coming down, the mountain of progesterone is rising. And so this cross effect of downgrading estrogen and upregulating progesterone, that can cause some central nervous system fatigue. I see with my athletes instances of their lowest motivation and their lowest quality of sleep because it can affect the hypothalamus, right? Estrogen and progesterone have antagonistic effects on the hypothalamus and the release of serotonin. And so your hypothalamus is a little bit all up and down and it doesn't quite understand what's going on. It's getting some mixed messages. And so then in the luteal phase, estrogen goes down, progesterone then hits its really high peak. And when progesterone is present, we are catabolic. So progesterone is catabolic for our muscles. So not only can we not build muscle in this phase, we can't build strength in this phase at the high end, we can't even maintain our muscles if we're not fueled correctly. And so if we hit a really big hypertrophy session or a max strength session in this phase, we're actually going to be taking away some of the gains that we deposited in the phase before. And so that's why it's really important to understand the effects of these hormones. And so with progesterone having its really high peak, you'll see estrogen have another small peak before that, and then both of them will downregulate very quickly, and that's what signals the shedding of the lining. So if the egg isn't fertilized, both of them come down substantially. That's where we see PMS, and premenstrual syndrome can affect between 40 and 91% of women, depending on what population you're looking at. And that's where some of your specific symptom interventions can come in. So what kind of symptoms are we experiencing? Are we experiencing some brain fog? Well, we might not have enough protein content in this phase, right? So we need protein. We've learned now with men that there's no anabolic window, right? There's no amount of time after a session that you need protein to get those gains, because men can get those gains if they get their protein in 24 hours. You have 24 hours to get your protein in. Like you can finish your workout and like come home and like turn on the TV and, you know, take a nap or whatever and take your time. Women have 30 minutes in this phase. We have 30 minutes that we have to get protein in. And if we don't, menstrual dysfunction can happen really quickly. So if we don't get that protein in to shut off that catabolic state when we're in this high hormone phase, then we can start to see menstrual dysfunction happen really quickly after, because we don't get this luteinizing hormone, and that's what it can affect. And so,
Doc, just to kind of get a better idea for myself, that the full cycle you're talking about is 28 days.
That is such a great question, and I'm glad you asked. No.
Okay.
I knew what you were going to say because I saw the presentation.
So we are taught that it's 28 days, and sometimes I explain it in a 28-day schedule because it's easy to conceptualize these 4 weeks. But the average length of the cycle, now that we know from this Clue app, and the study came out, and that's a study actually, Coach, I'll send your wife to learn about the syncing up. But the average length now is between 32 and 34 days. But it can be affected. I mean, you can have a fluctuation of, I think they've said almost up to 9 days from cycle to cycle of length. And when we look at the changes in length of the cycle, it affects the follicular phase. So you can have a lengthened follicular phase, but your luteal phase is pretty standard. But the average length is around 34 daof
But the kind of the peaks and valleys you were talking about in the beginning, I don't know if I misread this, but it seems like all of that, the different hormones, peaks and troughs are happening before. This is kind of pre-PMS. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so PMS happens when we see that really high mountain in the luteal phase, which is the second phase of the cycle. And then when progesterone from its very high mountain peak and estrogen from its smaller mountain peak, when they both downregulate, that's what can cause premenstrual syndrome. So that really quick downregulation can affect the hypothalamus, and that's when we would see some of those common effects: anxiety, depression, body aches, fatigue. That's where we would see that.
But in terms of the one rep max gains that you were talking about, that hacking, for lack of a better term, is happening kind of within the first 20, 21 days. Is that
So that happens right before or right after the midpoint of the cycle. So ovulation, when the uterus releases when the ovaries release the full egg, that's ovulation, and that's the very midpoint. And so that potential for 10% increase would happen right before ovulation.
So what's that window look like in days?
It depends on the length of cycle. So, I've got some athletes that have a really short cycle, like a 21-day cycle. I have some athletes that are, a lot later, like 38 days. And so that's why, I don't do ovulation tracking, but it's really easy. It's essentially, you can just get an ovulation predictor kit. But because I have so many athletes, that's not feasible. So I just look at symptoms and I can gauge, what phase they're in based on the combination of good and bad physical and emotional symptoms.
Well, am I wrong to say that window you talked about is small? It's a day or two. Is that?
Yeah, it can be. It's pretty small. It can be, about 2 days. But I think what's important to remember is that the phase in front of that, the follicular phase that precedes ovulation, which is the first day of the luteal phase, anywhere in that time would be more beneficial to hit training maxes than in the luteal phase, when your power output, your strength output, and submax output is diminished.
What are some of the strategies and techniques that you're using with your athletes to optimize the cycle, or if they're having issues with their cycle, what strategies are you using with your athletes to better optimize it for their performance?
Yeah,
you touched on nutrition, so I'd be really interested on like what you're doing with your athletes as far as that goes.
Nutrition is huge, and so working in the NCAA, I'm pretty limited in what I can say, not being our RD. And so I'm really lucky. I work with an incredible RD here, and we problem solve stuff together. So we had one athlete that, was having really certain symptoms, almost like concussion symptoms. And so the athletic trainer, the dietitian, and we problem solved. We got together. We said, okay, is she on birth control? What kind? Would she be willing to go off birth control? Athletic trainer's like, I can throw that question up. It's related to health. I think, we can see that some of these symptoms could be symptoms or outcomes of this birth control. Okay, she got on it for really significant cramps, almost debilitating, having a hard time practicing playing. And I, to the dietitian, I said, here are some strategies that I learned about supplementation wise that can really mitigate cramps. There's vitamin D, there's vitamin E options, there's magnesium and omega-3s. And so there's a number of different strategies that you can use to mitigate cramps. And he's like, absolutely. These are the ones that I've heard of. I can read up on it. I'll pull her in and talk to her. And so we can problem solve that together. But, specific nutrition wise, protein is huge. So most female athletes don't get enough protein. And when we look at the most recent position stand on nutrition and athletic performance, the recommendations for protein are standard. There's just one recommendation for strength and power athletes. So there's no differentiation between women and men, and there's no differentiation for women at one point in your cycle versus another. But, if we're largely catabolic, we're going to need more protein, and we're going to need it at more specific times. There's also when we have progesterone present in that luteal phase, we don't metabolize carbs as well. So not only can we not hit those high intensities because we're not using carbs for fuel, we're more fueled off of lipids. And so if we supplement in our pregame meal with heavy carbs, like we're taught to, then they get to the court and they can't actually use those carbs because their body has stored the carbs from the instance of progesterone rather than not fueling beforehand with as many carbs and getting more carbohydrate fuel during activity. Because if you supplement with carbs during activity, then you can use it more if you're in that luteal phase versus beforehand, it's just going to store it and you're not going to use it. So those are some of the strategies that working with our RD, he is incredible. He's super open to every, part of information that I give him. We ask really good questions of each other that we can problem solve together. In terms of training, I just straight up write different programs. So your reps, your sets, your volume and intensity is going to be different each week based on where you are. And, it's kind of one of those things where like athletes just do what's on their paper, right? So for the most part, you don't have athletes like, why am I not lifting, 150 kilos and she's lifting 170 kilos? Like the athletes they're like, they do what's on their paper. And I've had an athlete before be like, well, I want to do what they're doing. And I said, I'm so sorry, but because of your birth control and where you are, that's not going to be conducive to you. That's not going to be enough, stressor to develop that muscle protein synthesis of the mTOR system to get the same development. And so, I write different programs, and it has an intention for every part of their phase, right? And then I build those phases on top of each other. So if we're in the beginning of the follicular phase during menstruation and we're going to go for, basic strength in that phase, I don't like to go hypertrophy in that phase because usually we can have some hangover effects from that decline of progesterone and estrogen. And so I don't like to hit them with a ton of volume in that first week. I like to give them that volume in the end part of that phase when they have estrogen and testosterone to build that hypertrophy. That basic strength phase is going to build on the next cycle, is going to build on the next cycle, right? So instead of going linear and just having one outcome, it's like a very small pseudo block periodization scheme.
It almost seems like if they were synced, your job would be a whole lot easier. Are you writing individual prescriptions all the time?
No, so yes and no. I have a general, F1 is what I call the first half of the follicular phase, and F2 is what I would call the second half of the follicular phase. So I have a general prescription for F1 versus F2, and then I would just put in the calculations for their maxes. So essentially all you're doing is like when I'm writing my programs, I'm going through, okay, who are all my athletes that are going to be training at F1 this week? These are their rep sets. These are their intensity calculations. I put in their athlete code, their maxes pop up, and it calculates. So it's really similar to how we use Excel. The difficulty is when we get into the luteal phase, at times, long term, I would like to change the exercise selection. So changing the movements, because we change movements based on individuals, on injuries, on positions, things like that. And so I've done that with our volleyball team, where their mobility, they might have a little bit more mobility in there than strength work. But for the most part, their reps and sets and intensities are what change, and then conditioning can change really easily. So, I'll give this conditioning, card to these athletes that are in their follicular phase, and this athlete gets a luteal phase card, and you just do what you do. And sometimes they'll ask me, like, why don't I get to do what she does? And I said, well, that's because, the way the oxidative stress related with your birth control that you are on doesn't allow for you to have that high intensity work 3 days in a row. So we need to drop it down on this day, and then we're going to bring it up here. And so, if you understand the why behind it, then you can explain it. But I just go for it.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right, Sam, I told you this is how we were going to end it. Where is Dr. Moore going to be in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years?
Man,
I mean,
yeah.
I just think a lot of coaches need to understand, especially if you're working with female athletes, you need to take into consideration a lot of other things that you haven't thought about. And you're going to have open and honest conversations with your athletes. And like you said, it's going to be very important to be transparent with them and to explain to them why they are doing things that maybe their teammates aren't doing. Or, I mean, I think that's a great, part of the reason I wanted to talk to you was how great that presentation was, but also to explain to our listeners the importance of empowering the female athlete to have these discussions with the coaches that they work with, and the importance for the coaches to probably get out of their comfort zone and have these discussions with their female athletes, and how they can more empower them to be part of the process. You talked about the athlete coming back from her injury and her having that discussion with you, and how excited you were because she trusts you, and you have to build on that trust. But giving her the ability to have ownership of her, not only of her program, but of her menstrual cycle.
Right.
You know, so that, where are you going to be? Where are you going to be in 3 years, 5 years, and 10 years?
3 years. 3 years, I'll be done with my PhD. So maybe I'll be like, on an island taking a nap or something, like just a 2-week nap. Yeah, I think right now I want to be able to develop these applications in a really robust manner where I'm at. So, I want to take some of these training methodologies. I want to iron out some of these details. I want to fight these hurdles in real time so that when I, give them these protocols to my staff, that they're worked out, they know what to do, they know the frameworks. When I hit this roadblock, this is my solution. And so I want to simplify the application part of it, but I want to develop it in a really interdisciplinary sense. So I want to have some protocols in place for our nutrition and help them educating our athletes on what they need. And in our post-game nutrition, if you're phase 1, you go here, if you're phase 2, go here, or, just like names, like, to be able to do it on the individualized state, but to have it go program wide. And then in 5 years, oh my gosh, I'll be in my 30s. That'll be crazy. Yeah, I think
God bless you.
It wasn't supposed to be that funny of a joke, but thanks.
I mean, I'm not close to 30 anymore.
Yeah, I feel like it's right around the corner. Yeah, I think then long term, I want to move into more of a consulting role. And so it's really interesting because after the presentation, I had to make an LLC, which I didn't know how to do, and make a little website thing to direct people to, because I want to have this practical experience that I'm developing right now at NC State, and then I want to use it to go into different athletic programs, whether it's national team programs or university athletic departments or specific teams. And I want to help them create these protocols for who they have staff-wise and what they're working with athlete population-wise. And so, having this really integrated hands-on experience is necessary. And that's what I told Nate that I wanted in a job, so that I've got some validity, right? Because now, when you ask me those questions, if I were at Utah, I'd be like, well, here's what it says in research. And now I can say, this is how I've navigated this conversation. And this is how I implement this training. And this is what I saw with my wellness questionnaire and how I developed it. And so having this hands-on experience is really huge, but I want to move into a role where I can help teach people to do this, right? Because if we're going to revolutionize the way that we train and treat our female athletes, it can't just be me. I can't, have this information to myself and spend these years learning it and developing it so that my 2 teams at NC State get to experience it, right? We need to take this, we need to educate our coaches of the future how to do this. We need to educate our female athletes of the future. We need to tell people that positions like this are possible and are helpful. We need to create some dialogue in entire athletic departments around the female athlete and what their reality is, and how do we allow for this inclusive training and performance environment for them. And so that's what I would hope in 5 or so years that I'm doing is I'm helping teach coach education, athlete education, and department education, and then creating those specific protocols for these teams based on what they have. And I thought that was going to be 3 years out. And then after the presentation, I realized that's now, and I need to get my stuff together and figure it out now. Cause I've had people ask and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is overwhelming. I thought, I was going to be fighting for attention to people to stay on the line after Hootie. And I did not think that people were going to reach out the way that they did. And so it just shows that people are really hungry for this information, and that there's so much validity to it. People just don't quite know where to go for these resources. And so I want to be a resource for people to teach them how to do that. Like, let's take this worldwide. Let's truly change the way that we train our female athletes, because until we plan for the physiology of the athlete that's in front of us, we're going to continue to get these dismal and sometimes mystifying results, right? We have all this research on how these training strategies affect men, and we apply it to women, and then we get, less results or less development. And we assume, we just chalk it up to the fact that they're a woman. And I've heard those presentations on how women just can't gain strength like men. And, like they're just diminished and their upper body's never going to be the same, or, whatever it is. But what are women capable of when we train women like women? I mean, what can we accomplish in not only strength and conditioning, but in the athletic world at large? What does our performance look like when we begin to plan for the athlete that's in front of us?
That's pretty incredible. That's quite an undertaking. And when you finally do that, I'd say at the 10-year mark, you're cutting ribbons to athletic facilities that are named after you. That's going to be my prediction.
Whoa.
I just want to go to the cocktail hour.
You and me both, man. I was so nervous the biggest presentation I had before the basketball symposium was to my staff at NC State of these 9 dudes and 1 woman. And so this group of 10 was the biggest panel I had presented in front of. So then to go to the symposium, it's no wonder that my Apple Watch thought I was having a heart attack. I was very overwhelmed. I had to go lay under my weighted blanket in a dark room for 45 minutes before I could come back to my phone and read all the messages. You
knocked it out of the park. How
is that available somewhere to the general public? That presentation?
I believe that they streamed it on Facebook Live. So if you go to the High Performance Basketball Symposium Facebook, it's on there, and it's the whole day is in one, so you kind of have to figure it out of what presentation you like to watch.
Yeah, I mean, but if you want to learn, listen to all of them.
100%, yes.
I think once again, I'm so happy you took the time to talk with us today, because there's so much there's little to no information out there. And I'm sure all the female athletes that I worked with in the past are now yelling at whatever device they're listening to this, being like, "I told you, coach, I couldn't do that day because of blah, blah, blah." And it's like, all right, so at least understand that I'm trying to get better so I can better serve the athletes that I'm going to work with or now work with. How can somebody get in touch with you and go from there?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I was reading a new Brene Brown book the other day, and she was talking about how you can't shame people into changing their behavior, right? We have to educate and we have to encourage. But I would hope that no coach would ever listen to this presentation and think that I was shaming them for not knowing this or not looking into it, right? Because I didn't know about it until I heard one podcast, and I was like, oh, I'm going to go back and get my PhD on this. This seems like a good idea. More student loans, just throw them in the bag. And it's that Maya Angelou quote that, do the best you can with what you know. And then when you know better, do better. Right. So now that you know this, let's learn about it. Let's create these dialogues. Let's look for ways that we can allow for some flexibility in our programming to start talking about this. And so it doesn't mean everyone's going to go out and do, have these posters for their athletes and create these individualized programs. Not everybody has the capacity for that. So what strategies can we implement that can help start this change? My Instagram and Twitter are Sam More Strong, 2 M's, 2 O's. My email is srmmore8@ntsu, and it's on the staff directory. And then the website that I got to create in the last 2 weeks is moresportscience.com. So
awesome. When we started this podcast and we were throwing back names and we finally settled on Athlete Hackers, we were like, oh yeah, that's Chris and Mark. We're Athlete Hackers. And then as we go on, that has grown, that idea. It's all the other guests that came on who are college and professional athletes. And it's become just kind of a description of what we're all trying to do, even as parents. Even if you don't have a background in sports, you're still trying to do things to get your kid better. I think today we have the genesis of an actual elite athlete hacker. That's what this is like history in the making.
Oh man, I'm so thankful for this opportunity. I listened to your guys' episodes before this, and I love how well-rounded the guests are that you bring on, and they're so knowledgeable in their topics. And I think it's really incredible the way that you guys aren't afraid to bring in people that have really varied skill sets from what you have, because sometimes in college sport, we get so focused into this one thing that we talk about. And I'm so guilty of this. I love listening to podcasts on periods and, menstrual cycles and athletes and female athletes and things like that. But I get ideas, the idea of block periodization that came from Ernie, that's not in any of the range of menstrual cycle things that I've looked at. And so the openness that you guys clearly demonstrate with who you bring on this podcast and the conversations that you have is really powerful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We appreciate that. I mean,
Hey, first and foremost, thanks for listening.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think, the way we look at it is whatever it takes. I mean, that's what we're here. We're here to improve people, and we can't focus on just one thing. I mean, whatever it takes to get a person better, is what we're looking to do.
Yeah.
And the female athletes, I mean, last time I checked, there's more women in this world than there are men. So we better start addressing the things that female athletes are dealing with and trying to understand it better so we can serve them better.
Yeah.
Awesome.
That's awesome.
Well, Coach Moore, thank you for coming on. This has been a very special podcast. Come on with us again if you have the time. We'd love to have you back. I think There's a lot more to cover. No, I mean, we're probably just scratching the surface.
Oh yeah, I got way more posters.
Don't leave when we're done recording.
Okay.
All right, everyone. Thanks for turning in. You could reach us if you have any questions or if you want to be on the podcast at info@athletehackers.com. We're on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, a bunch of other podcasting sites. Mark?
Hey, have a great day. Be the best that you can be, and always strive to be better. All my best.
Awesome.
God bless.
Peace.
See ya.